Caitlin will be narrative out of an MVP for her entire career. And that's the problem, is that we're now at the stage where I think we're at the stage where the media was so wrong in one direction about Caitlin Clark that they're now being like, wait, why is she not getting more MVP coverage? When it's like, so basically they started the storm to create a narrative, and they're using that narrative to complain about the narrative they created. It's just a weird one.
That is the contradiction at the center of this entire MVP discussion. The same media environment that spent months questioning Caitlin Clark is now asking why she is not receiving more MVP attention. But the bigger issue goes beyond Clark. Later, you will hear the case for another MVP candidate, and that argument may reveal just how inconsistent the entire voting conversation has become.
You don't even need to really talk about too much about this. The Indiana Fever have gone 10-2 during Caitlin Clark's recent hot streak, and she's putting up historic numbers and career high marks. Still, she hasn't received the same MVP buzz as Olivia Miles. Why? Do you know who this was written by?
Start with the timing. Indiana has reportedly gone 10-2 during this recent run, with Clark playing extremely well and putting up some of the best and most important numbers of her career. So now people are asking why the MVP buzz has not followed. That sounds like a fair question, but remember what the conversation around Clark looked like just a few weeks earlier. That matters because MVP races are not decided in the final month. They are built throughout the entire season through repeated stories and opinions. Every TV debate, article, viral clip, and early season judgment helps shape the way voters see a player. If a player spends 2 months being discussed mostly because of turnovers, poor shooting games, mistakes, or questions about whether her team can play without her, you cannot simply erase all of that in August. You also cannot be surprised when another MVP candidate has a cleaner and more positive story around her.
How bad this take was. It is being written by 2 of the 3 members of the Athletic podcast. The publication where Annie was like, yeah, who agreed with basically like there needs to be a canon event, such as Caitlin going to the bench and Raven Johnson starting, for her to maybe realize, maybe I'm not the birthday. Like,
that is
I'm
where
sorry.
The criticism starts to become uncomfortable. The commentator is referring back to an earlier discussion where people considered whether Raven Johnson could potentially replace Clark in the starting lineup. Whether someone seriously supported that idea or was simply discussing the possibility, the contrast is hard to ignore. You cannot spend June asking whether the team's star point guard should be moved to the bench and then act surprised when she does not have strong MVP momentum a short time later. And this creates a very different situation for Clark. A normal star can have a bad game, and it is treated as just one bad game. When Clark has a bad game, it can become evidence in a much bigger debate about everything related to her. Her shot selection, turnovers, leadership, chemistry, body language, and even the way she interacts with her teammates can all become part of the discussion. That creates a completely different standard of evaluation. The important question is not whether Clark should be criticized. Of course she should be when she plays poorly. The real question is whether everyone is being judged by the same standard when their performances change.
Is a weird player to evaluate because the highs are so high, but there are weird lows. Like game 1 of the season versus Dallas was a weird game. Like, they're weird games. And the problem with Caitlin is that everyone watches every move she makes. It's not even just on the court. It's off the court. It's how she interacts with her teammates. It's how she warms up. She's the most hyper-analyzed player in the league. So that you're seeing the media where it's like, you can either look at Caitlin Clark with like obviously, duh, she's clearly the MVP. Look at what she's doing.
And this is probably the fairest point in the entire source. Clark can be difficult to evaluate because her best moments are incredible, but some of her worst moments can also be confusing. It is better to admit that instead of pretending every performance is perfect. If she has a bad game, say she had a bad game. If she turns the ball over too much, point it out. If Indiana loses because the offense becomes stagnant, that should also be part of the evaluation. But the same standard has to be used for every other player. With Clark, almost every possession is closely watched. One inefficient stretch can dominate the entire conversation, even when her overall numbers are still good. Meanwhile, another MVP candidate can start slowly, improve later in the game, and the story becomes about how well she recovered instead of how poorly she started. That difference in how players are described matters because awards are not decided by statistics alone. Real people vote for them, and people remember stories. There is another important part that often gets overlooked. Clark's value cannot be judged only by her own statistics. The Fever's entire offense changes when she is on the court. Defenders pay more attention, spacing changes, and her teammates get different opportunities. That does not automatically make Clark the MVP, but it does mean the debate needs to go beyond simply comparing points, rebounds, and assists. And the next clip shows exactly why one of her teammates becomes an important part of this argument.
Nothing to do with process, but when Caitlin Clark is off the floor, there has never been a greater contested shot maker in the history of basketball, statistically, than Kelsey Mitchell this season when Caitlin Clark is off the floor. Like, she doesn't ever get an open shot when Caitlin's off the floor, and she's making magic. So
Kelsey Mitchell is a perfect example of this. The source argues that when Clark is not on the court, Mitchell has to take a huge number of difficult, contested shots, and she still makes an impressive number of them. That is not a criticism of Mitchell. In fact, it shows how talented she is as a scorer. But it also helps explain how much Clark's presence affects the game, without pretending that Clark creates every one of Mitchell's baskets. When the team's main playmaker is on the floor, defenses have to respect her long-range shooting, her ability to drive, her passing over the defense, and the pressure she creates in transition. When that threat is removed, the next scorer suddenly has to create much harder shots on her own. This is why the MVP debate is more complicated than simply saying one player scored 26 points and another scored 24. The better question is, what happens to the entire team and the way the game is played because that player is on the court? And this is also where the media narrative can become dangerous. Once a story is established early, people can start interpreting every new statistic through that story instead of allowing the new evidence to change their minds.
Thing where it's like, people are like, why hasn't she received more MVP buzz? And it's like, because the media spent, May, June, and July? Like, she won Player of the Month in June. Do you want to know what came out of that month? So Caitlin wins Player of the Month. Do you know what came out of the month? What came out of the month was a conversation about whether or not Caitlin Clark needs to apologize to Alyssa Thomas for, unfortunately, having her neck get in the way of Alyssa Thomas's fist. Whether Caitlin Clark... Like, that was all it was. Caitlin Clark got injured. The Mercury took out Caitlin Clark and she was being asked to apologize.
This is the part that should concern anyone who wants fair and consistent analysis. The source points out that Clark won Player of the Month, but the conversation around her quickly moved toward controversy instead of focusing on the basketball that earned her the award. Some of the original commentary is clearly exaggerated, and the details of specific physical incidents can be debated. But the bigger point is still important. When a player's strong performance becomes a secondary story while controversy becomes the main story, it can affect how people view that player. Think about the difference. One player has a great month, and the conversation is about how high she can move in the MVP race. Another player has a great month, but the conversation becomes, what controversy are we talking about now? The two players could have similar numbers, but they are being discussed in very different ways. This does not prove that voters are working together against Clark. There is no evidence of that here. A conspiracy is not necessary. Narrative momentum can happen naturally because people click on conflict. Commentators talk about the biggest controversy, and then that discussion keeps growing. That is why the source's point about the media creating a storm and then asking why the storm exists is so powerful. You do not need secret meetings for this cycle to happen. You only need incentives that reward controversy.
And like, look, the odds of Caitlin Clark winning August Eastern Conference Player of the Month are high right now. There's what? We'll know by the end of the Chicago game. We'll know if she's won it or not. Because Shakira Austin's been great. She's won a Player of the Week. Kelsey Mitchell's been great. But the odds of Caitlin Clark winning a second Player of the Month and fourth or fifth Player of the Week by the end of August are not high.
And now, the timing becomes even more important. The source believes Clark has put herself in a strong position for another monthly award because of how well she has played in August, while Mitchell has also been playing at a very high level. So this is no longer just a hypothetical discussion. If they both continue to perform like this, voters will eventually have to decide how much the early season story should matter compared to the player Clark has become during this recent run. But this is where the story gets more complicated. Even if you believe Clark has been judged too harshly, that does not automatically mean she should win MVP. Those are two completely different arguments. Mixing them together can make award debates emotional instead of fair and analytical. You can believe Clark deserves much more respect and still decide that another player has the strongest MVP case. And according to this source, the player who could create the biggest problem for both Clark and Aya Wilson is not the player most people would expect. This final exchange brings the whole conversation together because it shows how quickly MVP debates can turn into arguments between players. Mention another young star like Paige Buchers, and suddenly the discussion can move away from the original standard. That is exactly what should be avoided. The MVP race is more interesting when Caitlin Clark, Aya Wilson, Veronica Burton-Miles, and every other serious candidate are allowed to have strong cases at the same time. Clark becoming a stronger candidate does not mean Miles is a fraud. Miles winning does not mean Clark is overrated. Wilson continuing to dominate does not mean her team's record should be ignored. The real issue is the standard being used. Clark has spent much of the season being judged possession by possession, mistake by mistake, and headline by headline. Because people are so used to seeing everything she does, even great performances can start to feel normal. When an amazing performance becomes expected, people sometimes stop appreciating it and start looking for the mistakes instead. That is one reason MVP momentum can sometimes fall behind actual production. But the media cannot solve that problem by replacing one unfair narrative with another. If Clark finishes the season with historic numbers and Indiana continues to improve, she deserves serious MVP consideration. If Wilson combines elite offense and defense with a strong finish for Las Vegas, she deserves serious consideration too. And if Miles continues to be the main force behind a Golden State team that separates itself from the rest of the league while she keeps performing in the biggest games, her rookie status should not be used as a reason to dismiss what could be a classic MVP season. That is the real test now. It should not be about who has the loudest defense on social media, whose fans create the most viral clips, or which player received the most preseason predictions. The real test is whether everyone is judged by the same rules once the entire season is available to evaluate. This is especially important for Clark because her early season story has already been written. Every strange loss, poor shooting night, and debate about how Indiana performs with or without her became part of the argument against her. The only way to change that story is through consistent performances so strong that the old narrative no longer explains what people are actually watching. That appears to be happening during this recent run. But changing the narrative and winning the MVP are still two different things. Clark can prove her early critics wrong without finishing first in MVP voting. Miles can win MVP without proving she is the better long-term player. Wilson can remain one of the best players in basketball without automatically having the strongest MVP case this season. Those differences are what make the debate worth having. So now the voters face a choice, and so do you. If the season ends with Clark producing the most historic individual numbers, Wilson showing the strongest two-way dominance, and Miles leading the league's clear number one team while winning the biggest games, which standard should decide the award? Should it be individual production, complete two-way impact, or being the best player on the best team? Pick one, because whatever rule you choose should apply to everyone. Drop your MVP choice in the comments and explain why you think your standard is the right one. And if you want the rest of this MVP race judged by the evidence instead of the loudest narrative, like the video and subscribe.